Thank you. Well, the person I'm talking about should turn up on screen in a moment. We can go click over there, please. Hyman Minsky, because he was the reason I saw why the financial crisis was coming. And if I can explain why in 3 words why he saw it coming, because he had this idea that stability is destabilising, which is a completely different perspective on the economy to the standard belief of conventional economists. And what they believe is that nobody could have seen this crisis coming. And they actually told that to the Queen of England in a rather amusing seminar where as she very rarely does, she spoke out and asked this very confronting question: if these things were so large, how come everybody missed them? Why did nobody notice it? And the answer is given by a conventional economist was this: that everybody was relying upon somebody else and nobody could have seen it coming. But from my point of view, it was as obvious as the nose on a black swan. Because when you take a look at it, it was driven by a boom in both debt and then a collapse in debt, private debt. And that's what I really want to explain to you today. We're having a bit of fun here trying to do coordination between myself and the guy running the presentation up in the booth there. Now, what conventional economists saw is what they called the Great Moderation. And this is Ben Bernanke saying that what was happening from 1980 or 1990 forward was a reduction in volatility. And that was a really good thing called the Great Moderation. And this is what he was seeing: a tendency for inflation and unemployment to fall, and for the depths of each recession, so the height of each bump on the unemployment there, to get smaller. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, unemployment rose and there was deflation. And they had no idea why it was coming. Now, to me it was obvious, but the big question is, why didn't they see it coming? Well, there was a factor they ignored, and it was rising private debt. So at the same time as the data I've shown you just a moment ago was happening, there's the black line of rising private debt. So the data was there. In fact, the Federal Reserve that Bernanke spoke for was actually recording that data. That's where the data comes from. So I'm asking, can you put these together in any particular way? What happens when you combine private debt, unemployment and inflation? You get this. So the private debt's showing vertically. You've got a spiral of unemployment and inflation on the bottom level and this rising level of private debt. Does this look anything like the pattern I've just shown you? This is out of a computer model. And I think there's a similarity there. Much smoother in the model that I'm showing you, but definitely there's something being captured in that model that's also in the data. And behind it, the model I've just shown you is generated by this system. Which I presume looks pretty complicated, okay? But in fact, I can reduce that model to a few very simple and categorically true statements. And they're using what's called system dynamics, but I've reduced that to what's called a reduced form set of equations. I get these 3 simple but complex statements. The first one, and they're irrefutable too, by the way. The first one is that the employment rate, level of population that's employed, will rise if the rate of economic growth exceeds the sum of population growth and growth in labour productivity. That's simply a fact. If the rate of growth of the economy exceeds those 2 levels, then employment will grow. The second one is also a fact. If workers demand, in money wage terms, increases in wages that exceed the sum of inflation and the growth in labour productivity, then the wage share of output will rise. That's also a fact. And the third fact is that the ratio of private debt to GDP will rise if the rate of growth of private debt exceeds the sum of inflation plus economic growth. So those are 3 categorical facts. You can deny them, but denying them is a bit like denying gravity. It's bad for your health. So let's just take a look at what happens. What you get is something you can't disagree with, but the complexity you get arises out of how they interact together. And you could never work out that interaction just by looking at the data, looking at the words. You've got to actually simulate it and see what happens. And that's what's been done in that program, and that's what I generated in the model I've shown you a moment ago. But that's also what Minsky himself observed in reverse by looking at the economic data from 1945 forward and saying, what's going on here? What can explain the fact we haven't had a crisis for so long? We had a huge one in the Great Depression. What can explain those two things together? So Minsky's explanation is what he called the financial instability hypothesis. And looking at capitalism, his conclusion about the nature of capitalism will probably gel with a lot of people in this room, and that was that it's inherently flawed. Okay? But not because it'll stagnate, which is the conventional, what I call cardboard cutout Marxian version of capitalism. It's because it's due to characteristics that the financial system has to have to enable capitalism to progress, and that will generate signals that give you an accelerating rate of inflation, a rate of investment, as well as the capacity to finance that investment. And he called this model the financial instability hypothesis. And cycles, debt and non-equilibrium behaviour are at the absolute centre of how he thought. Now, cycles, debt and non-equilibrium are completely outside conventional economic thinking. They don't understand why they don't understand why the first and the third one happen, and they can't understand why the middle one matters. So if you take a look at his hypothesis, he says that the natural point to start from in looking at the economy is to look at the relationship between debt and income. And again, those are two factors that economists don't include in their models. And to take an economy which has a cyclical past, which again they don't have, but take a point when it's actually doing well. And then he says at that point in time, the debt you have at that time will reflect a previous period when there was a crisis caused by debt. And therefore, the amount of margin people require for safety in their borrowing will be quite high. And what happens, though, as the economy recovers, is people realise that existing debts were actually easier to finance than they thought they would be, and organisations that were heavily in debt did well. It pays to lever. So after the event, they think, well, we had too high a margin of safety. So what we should do over time, as bankers and as investment people and so on, is reduce those margins of safety to have an increase in the acceptable amount of debt used to finance investment. Now what that means is that increases the amount of debt compared to equity will occur in investments. And the economy gets transformed from one doing well into a boom. So a period of tranquil growth leads to a period of speculative excess. One leads to the other. So stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which we finance investment in a capitalist economy. So he said the fundamental instability of capitalism is upward, and this is a profound difference to the vast majority of critics of capitalism who tend to see capitalism heading to stagnation. Minsky says the fundamental instability is upward. The tendency to transform doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability in a capitalist economy. That's a very profound insight, very, very different both to the mainstream of conventional economics that sees no instability at all, or the vast majority of critics of capitalism who believe it stagnates. Minsky's saying no, it causes a bubble first, then it bursts. So it's a non-equilibrium process that's going on here. And spelling it out step by step verbally, the first stage is you have to take an economy that's in historical time. That's very different to conventional theory that leaves out both history and time. Since you're in historical time, there's been a debt-induced recession in the recent past. That means that both firms and banks are conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on for investment purposes. Therefore, only conservative projects get funded. But because the economy is in a recovery phase, most of those projects succeed. Since they succeed, firms think and banks both think, oh, we were too conservative. We should have had more gearing. So the accepted ratio of debt to income rises, debt to equity rises. You put a high valuation on assets, so houses start getting more expensive and so do shares. And for a while that self-fulfilling expectations gives you a lot of positive feedbacks, the first one of which is good. And that is that since you have a decline in risk aversion, there's more investment. Since there's more investment, the economy grows faster. Then asset prices start to rise, which makes speculation on assets profitable. There's an increased willingness to lend, and that actually increases the money supply. So the money supply, as Minsky thinks, and even the Central Bank of England now emphasises, the money supply is not controlled by the central bank, it's controlled by the system in general, the capitalist system, the relations between bankers and firms in particular. So you get riskier investments being enabled, more and more asset speculation. And you get what Minsky ultimately calls the euphoric economy, which is a great phrase, where what he calls euphoric expectations mean that people he called Ponzi financiers can now become prevalent. Have you heard of Ponzi? Charles Ponzi? Okay. 10 years ago, nobody had. Okay. These days, most people know who I'm talking about. Now, a Ponzi financier is somebody whose investments have cash flows that are less than the debt servicing costs. So technically, they're bankrupt. How do they profit? They sell their assets on a rising market. That's how they make a profit. They're losing money before the asset sale, they make a fortune on the asset sale, they go on to the next asset and on they go. Now that means they've got a desperate demand for finance because they're fundamentally insolvent. If it wasn't for the cash flow coming in from the banks, which they've borrowed, they wouldn't be able to pay their outgoings, they'd go bankrupt. So they've got to borrow to service existing debt before they make an asset sale. And they therefore have a very insensitive demand for finance. They'll pay anything to get extra debt, because without it, they're cactus, as Americans would say. So initially, the profitability of asset speculation means that sensitivity to debt's reduced, people worry less about interest rates. That drives up both the supply of and the demand for money. Market rates can rise, and you also get a change in income distribution as it goes on further. And that is because when the economy goes into a boom, workers can demand larger wages, so wage rises will occur. The cost of raw materials, things like oil and coal, will increase in price as well, as we've seen very recently too. And given all that, you get to the stage where there's going to be a boom and a bust. Eventually, the growth of debt will break down for an internal reason. It doesn't take an external force, an exogenous shock like the Reserve Bank increasing rates unilaterally to cause the system to crash. For a start, the change in the structure of costs, increasing wage costs, increasing raw material costs, undermines those expectations of profit. The Ponzi's are necessarily losing money all the way through. So all it takes is for them to, because they're accumulating debt all the time and they're selling the shares in their own business to get themselves going at the same time, they spread through the entire economy, they can suddenly crash if they fail to roll over debts in time. Now, my favourite example of that is an Australian Ponzi you wouldn't have heard of called Christopher Skase. He died about 5 or 10 years ago. He made a $3 billion takeover for MGM, which Sony finally purchased. His takeover bid was turned down, and 1 week later he went bankrupt when he couldn't pay a $12 million loan instalment. 3 billion, 12 million, what's going on? Okay. If he got the takeover bid offered, accepted, he would have got 3 billion, paid the 12 million with small change from that and kept on going. Because he couldn't get that renewal, he was done. Quite a dramatic collapse. Now, also at the same time, many of those investments that were undertaken during that euphoric economy phase are based on euphoria. They're not going to work. They'll fail as well. Even if you have conservatively worked out a good investment project, the rising interest rates can also make you fall into the level where you've got to sell some assets to keep on going. You end up being speculative, and before you were what Minsky called hedge finance. And therefore you can have people who are not Ponzi's, who attempt to sell assets into what they think is a very broad market to service their debts, and that entry of new sellers floods the market and it collapses. The market's nowhere near as broad and as strong as people think it is. So that rising trend of asset prices falters, goes into reverse, And the first ones to go are the Ponzi's, because they can't sell assets for profit anymore, and their debt servicing costs far exceed their cash flows. Asset prices collapse. There's a drastic increase in debt-to-equity ratios because equity falls while debt remains the same, and that expansion of the money supply goes into reverse. Investment evaporates, economic growth stops or goes into reverse. You're back where you started from. Now, if you think about the period from the boom of the 1990s and the collapse of the 1990s after the 87 boom, then you have the 1992 revival starting through first of all the telecommunications bubble, then the dot-com bubble, then the subprime bubble. To subprime, that's the process I'm talking about. Now, what Minsky says, it continues going on several times, and what happens afterwards in the process depends upon a couple of factors. First of all, the inflation rate. So if you have a high inflation rate, and secondly, the size of the government sector. If you have high inflation, like we had back in the 70s and 80s, then that debt can be repaid by a rising price level. And the growth will remain slow at the same time, so you have stagflation. So this is a Keynesian explanation, so to speak, of a thing that Keynesians weren't supposed to understand. And when conventional people say Keynesian, they mean Samuelsonian, for anybody who's suffered through a macroeconomics course. So it's bugger all to do with Keynes. Well, you can find bits and pieces in the general theory, but it isn't Keynes's original contributions. And then you'll get a renewal of the cycle once the inflation has reduced the debt burden. The other thing is, if you have low inflation, on the other hand, then you can't repay the debts using the price level, and you can have a chain reaction of bankruptcies that put even non-speculative businesses out of business, and you get into a depression, which is the 1930s, which is what we're experiencing now, certainly in southern Europe. Big government is another factor, and that's with anti-cyclical spending and taxation. That can give the businesses cash flow they wouldn't have normally during a downturn, so they can repay their debts. And that also means the cycle can begin afterwards. So that's the basic story. Now, Minsky was ignored by the mainstream until his predictions came true. Great timing, eh? Taken seriously after. This is Cassandra's problem. You're not believed until after what you're predicting happens. But they still reject his main point that private debt matters. And this might sound bizarre, but people who are supposed to be experts on the economy argue that private debt doesn't matter, and I'm sure most of you think, yeah, it does. What's your problem? Well, the problem is not the empirical data. If you look at the empirical data, and you can find a very strong relationship, and I'll show you that in a moment, it's because they have a belief, as Latin for a priori, before the fact, and they refuse to test that belief. So that prior that they have about debt is that private debt is simply a redistribution. Increase in private debt means somebody who's a saver has handed money over to somebody who's a borrower. And what that means is they think, well, you can't explain a crisis using debt. Now, Ben Bernanke got the job of chairman of the Federal Reserve on the basis that he was the expert about the Great Depression. And one of the strongest arguments about why it happened was by Irving Fisher, and he had what he called the debt deflation theory. Now, Bernanke completely dismissed this theory. He said the idea goes back to Fisher, and he envisaged a dynamic process with falling asset prices, etc., causing pressure on nominal debtors, yada, yada, yada. But he then said this idea was less influential in academic circles than it was with Roosevelt at the time because of the counter-argument, and read this carefully, that debt deflation represented no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to the other group, creditors. Now, this is implying that people who've gone bankrupt during a debt deflation repay their debts. The whole idea about a debt deflation is people who go bankrupt can't repay their debts. It's nonsense, even at this stage. And he goes on from that to argue that the only way, assuming that that the debtors pay their debts back, which is what he's doing, which is bizarre during a debt deflation, he then says the only way that can cause a crisis is if the people who are paying back the debts were much bigger spenders than those who are receiving the debt payments. It's partially true, But he said that's the only level that can have any macroeconomic impact, change in the spending propensities of borrowers and savers. Now that's argument, even though we've now had a debt crisis again, and rather than talking about something that happened before he was born, as prior to the Great Depression for Ben Bernanke and Paul Krugman, I'm about to quote here, they're maintaining it even after they've lived through this crisis. And the essence of what they're arguing is what's known as the Loanable Funds model of lending. This is quoting Paul Krugman from his book End This Depression Now. And he says, when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. In other words, what he's saying, lending does not create money. You might think that's wrong. You're right, and Krugman is wrong. What he says is, it's just a case of patient people lending to impatient people. And I think that's incredibly childish, by the way, but that's the sort of thing that mainstream economists get Nobel Prizes for. Now, looking at it with system dynamics, I've put together a model, a neoclassical model, modelling what they think lending is like. And all they do is treat banks as intermediaries between savers and borrowers that arrange loans, that don't actually make lending themselves. So that, funnily enough, believe it or not, in the models they put forward and the literature they write and what they teach students in their macroeconomic textbooks is banks don't lend money. Interesting planet that'd be, wouldn't it? So this is in Egerton and Krugman. They have a patient consumer agent lending to an impatient investment agent. And the investment agent pays interest to the consumer agent, and the bank charges the fee for arranging the loan. But that's the only role the bank has is to arrange the loan. It doesn't actually lend the money, just charges the fee for doing this lending story. Now, they're both hire workers, buy alcohol from each other, sell it to workers in the bank, and the investing agent then changes how fast he or she borrows and repays. And this, well, if that was the real world, would debt matter? And the answer is no, and I can just show you a simulation of that. Again, if I had the model running on my computer, I could show you live, but I have the full model looking like this. And this is showing it the way accountants look at it. Any accountants in the room? Didn't think so. Okay. What you have is lending is a transfer from the consumer agent to the investment agent, and debt doesn't turn up there at all. It's looking at the economy from the bank's point of view. So I've got reserves, which the bank assets, and I've got the liabilities, which the investments the sector's account, the consumer sector's account, the workers' deposit account, and then the banker's equity. So there's no sign of debt there because it's not an asset of the bank, or a liability of the bank for that matter. So where does it turn up? Well, it turns up in the consumer sector's vision of the economy. So now I've got two columns to show what the consumer sector is worth. The first is their bank account, CD, consumer deposit account, and the second is the debt. And if lending goes on, then that reduces the amount of cash that the consumer agent has at the bank and increases the amount of debt that's owed to them by the investment agent. So that's what's going on for lending. And of course they've got to do without, the consumer agent has to do without cash while the loan is operating. So when you simulate this, what you find is debt doesn't matter. On that model you can see the growth graph in the top left-hand corner there, and you see it's pretty much zero with a few blips. And if you look down to the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see GDP in the second graph almost flatlining, and the very bottom one, the huge increase and fall in the debt to GDP ratio, doesn't have much impact upon the economy. So if they're correct about the institutional nature of lending, we could ignore debt. Okay? But I'm going to say something really radical here. What if, just maybe what if, banks actually lend money? What happens if I change it to let banks lend money? Well, what I then get is what we call the model of endogenous money, and now the Bank of England is trying to tell these guys, the conventional economists, that it does matter, because when I make the same sorts of variations here, those are the sorts of changes you get. Increases in the rate of lending and decreases in repayment cause a boom in the growth level. You can see growth now goes up and down in booms and slumps and falls below zero at various times. The amount of money rises with the amount of debt, so lending does create money. and GDP rises and falls depending on whether there's an expansion or a contraction in the level of debt. So that's the real world. And when you look at the real world we're in and say, how do we get into this crisis? We're actually living, as well as being in the middle of the greatest, well, the only ecological crisis we've experienced as a species so far, but an enormous ecological crisis, we're also experiencing a debt bubble. And we happen to have the highest level of debt in the history of capitalism. So the crisis of the 1930s barely even, well, it does register in terms of private debt levels, but it's less than the level of debt that we experience today. And of course, they've turned out, they've unintentionally, because it'd take an ideological bias to get, they'd have to be bribed to make us not look at this stuff. And most of them are saying for money what they'd say for free anyway. So it's not the bribe that's making them ignore this stuff. But that's the scale of the debt bubble we're in. It has burst. But what's happened in the meantime is the public sector's taken on the debt that the private sector couldn't finance. So now flatlining with an aggregate level of debt. And the same thing applies for virtually every country in the world. So my little motto about that is the world has turned Japanese. You want to know the Vapors song, I imagine? Turning Japanese? Maybe not. Check it on YouTube. It's a good song. Because if you go back to Japan, you find it had a crisis that began in 1990. And this is superficially, people all focus now on the level of government debt. And if you look at the level of government debt, which is the blue line, yeah, rising like crazy, isn't it? But notice it started far below the level of private debt. Then the crisis hit in 1990. Private debt, the ratio of private debt to GDP continued rising, but it then fell, and now it's flatlining at about 175% of GDP. Well, my argument is the rate of change of debt is what drives the level of the economy. So this is the next. Let's now look at the rate of change of debt and the level of unemployment. And what you find is there's almost a perfect negative correlation between the two. Rising debt means falling unemployment and vice versa. So that's the Japanese data. And that data's been around, since, as you can see, since 1965. So the information has been there to find. It's just been ignored, very much like the global warming situation. Okay? The deniers don't look at the data that matters. They make up their own, their basic story. They prefer their own set of facts to the ones that are real. There's 15 years of deleveraging that Japan's been stuck in. And you still find economists debating about what caused the crisis and rejecting the arguments of people like Richard Coase to why it actually took place. So the same story applies in the USA. This is now the USA's relationship between change in debt and the level of unemployment, an even stronger correlation than I showed you for the Japanese data, though over a shorter time period. And what you find is the rate of change of debt's gone from being 15% of GDP per annum during the boom to minus 5% during the depth of the slump, and it's now back to about 5% per annum. But it'll never get back to the same level of growth as it was beforehand because the debt level is simply too high. It's like trying to accelerate past the peak of Everest. It gets pretty hard up in thin atmosphere. So my medium-term prognosis for the world is that because we have politicians around the globe obsessing about government debt, they're going to be biased towards austerity. So government stimulus, when it comes in, will be applied as the economy falters, as it has been in Japan, and it will halt the private sector deleveraging for a while, as it has in Japan. Then it will be withdrawn when the economy appears to recover, as it did in Japan. And the private sector will resume deleveraging, as it has done in Japan, and the economy will tank again, as it has in Japan. So we're going to keep on repeating the same thing ad nauseum, as they've done in Japan. I'm now talking about 1/4 of a century. Okay? Some of you in the room haven't been alive that long. So we need a change in thinking as well as a change in policy. And the crisis was a surprise in the first place because of conventional economics, known as neoclassical economics. And the inadequate response we're seeing is also a product of that economics. Because even though most neoclassicals, including people that I fight with all the time, like Paul Krugman, agree a deficit is needed now, even highly conservative neoclassicals agree with that, let alone somebody as progressive as Paul Krugman, they still believe that government spending should be balanced over the long term. So they'll go back to reducing the debt levels when there's a recovery. And this is because they have what they believe is true in a static economy without money. We live in a growing economy, or a changing economy, with money. And if the government spending is balanced over the long term in an economy like ours, then the only source of new money is bank-created credit, which means an increase in private debt, which means you're setting yourself up for another crisis, that that's the only way you generate money in a mixed economy. So we need a new way of thinking about economics. And the neoclassical model is a fantasy. It's as relevant to the real economy as Cinderella is to real society. So real-world economics, first of all, admits that new debt creates new demand and income. The debt repayment reduces demand and income. But debt bubbles can and do occur, and we're living in the biggest of them of all time right now. And that until we reduce private debt, stagnation will be the rule. Now, the best way to reduce this debt level is by what I call a modern debt jubilee. In that kind of us realising we're not as bright as we thought we were, and the ancients who used to do debt jubilees on a regular basis were wiser than we are. My computer's thrown up a random program here, pardon me, I'll get rid of that. Okay. So that idea would be that the central bank would credit all private bank accounts, regardless of whether you're in debt or not in debt. The debtors would have to pay their debts down, but savers would get a cash injection, so savers would not be disadvantaged by the Jubilee. And you'd reset the system to having much more state money, fiat money, and much less credit money, and then redesign the banking system out of that as well to reduce the financing of speculative bubbles, which has been all the financial sector's really done for the last 15 years, and to increase the funding to entrepreneurs and businesses. So we need, as well as a change in economic policy, we need a change in economic thought, and there are some ways to get that. If you want to read Minsky, please don't read Stabilising an Unstable Economy. It's a dreadful book. Okay? A lot of Minskyites won't like me saying that, but compared to his very first book, it's terrible. His best, and it's long, and I actually noticed Paul Krugman once reading it and saying that the experience of reading Minsky was less than the Platonic ideal of reading Minsky. He's completely right, he bought the wrong book. It happened to be the last one he wrote. It took 15 years to write it. He didn't say much more original to it. That's the best one. If you want to get a good handle on Minsky immediately, that's a paperback with short essays, 15, 20 pages. Read any of the essays in that book, you'll understand what Minsky's talking about. And if you want a long version, one called John Maynard Keynes, which is not a biography. It's named in tribute to Keynes. It's not based on Keynes. It's not a biography of Keynes himself. So those are the two I'd recommend. But the first one, Can It Happen Again? A good read, 15-page essays. You'll understand 95% of what Minsky's on about by reading any one of the essays in that book. If you want to look at where I come from, I've got a couple of contributions. This is the main one, my book Debunking Economics. You can imagine I'm fairly polite in that about conventional economic theory. Not. I also blog for Forbes magazine, and there's a website called Idea Economics, which is trying to assist me in developing a non-orthodox approach to economic theory. And I have a blog as well called debtdeflation.com, where you'll see videos like this, as well as my Forbes things being linked in. And overall, you need a new way of thinking about the economy, and that's what I'm trying to organise at Kingston University. So if you want to learn economics in a very different way, come and join me at Kingston. Thank you.